He paid a stranger's debt in silver coin and walked away with her hand. And she had no idea the quiet, scarred ferryman had been searching for her face in every crowd for 11 years. The autumn of 1883 came hard to the Ohio River bottoms. It came in the color of rust and the smell of mold, in the sound of creditors' boots on warped porch boards, and the sight of smoke rising from chimneys that couldn't afford to stay lit much longer. For Edmund and Hattie Voss, that autumn arrived wearing the face of Cornelius Braid. Braid was not a violent man, which somehow made him worse. He was a small, precise man with a waxed mustache and a leather satchel he carried everywhere, as though the ruin he delivered required documentation. He had bought Edmund's grain debt from the First Merchant Bank of Cincinnati the previous spring, and he had waited, with the patience of a spider, for the summer crops to fail. They had not disappointed him. On the Tuesday he came to collect, Edmund Voss stood on the porch of his river-bottom farm in Gallatin County and held his hat in both hands the way men do when they have nothing left to hold. Behind him, through the thin plank wall, his wife Hattie coughed steadily into a rag she kept folded in her apron. She had been coughing since August, the kind of cough that scared children and kept husbands awake. Their daughter stood at the kitchen window. Her name was Violet Voss, and she was 22 years old. She had her mother's gray eyes, and her father's stubbornness, and a stillness about her that people sometimes mistook for coldness. It was not coldness. It was the particular kind of quiet that a person develops when they have learned that most things in life arrive without warning and leave the same way. She had worked this farm since she was 9. She knew the smell of bad soil and broken promises. She knew the look on her father's face right now. Braid opened his satchel. The debt was $460. The farm was worth perhaps $300 if you were being generous and if you didn't look too hard at the north fence. Braid said he would take the land, the outbuildings, the mule, and the contents of the root cellar. He said it the way a man says something he has said many times before and expects no argument. Edmund said nothing. He had no argument to give. There is, Braid added, closing his satchel with a neat snap, one other arrangement. His eyes moved past Edmund to the window where Violet stood. I operate a boarding house in Paducah, a well-run establishment. I require a capable woman to manage the domestic staff. A contract of 4 years would satisfy the remaining balance and allow your family to retain the property. The word boarding house landed in Violet's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She knew what men like Braid meant by boarding house. She had heard the stories that came down the river on flatboats, wrapped in the careful language women use to warn each other. Edmund's hands tightened on the brim of his hat. Before he could speak, the sound of a horse cut across the yard, not the nervous clatter of a newcomer's arrival, but the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who did not hurry, because he had learned that hurrying rarely changed outcomes. A single dark horse, a blood bay with one white stocking, came around the bend in the river road and stopped at the edge of the Voss property with the particular stillness of an animal trained to wait. The man who rode it was not large in the showy way of men who want to be noticed. He was lean and weathered, with the kind of economy of movement that comes from spending years in places where waste gets you killed. His coat was old canvas, mended at both elbows. His hat was a plainsman's felt, beaten nearly shapeless by river weather. He had a short beard the color of creek mud and eyes that, when they finally settled on the porch, did not move again. Those eyes found Violet's face through the kitchen window and stayed there for 3 full seconds before dropping to Braid. His name was August Pruitt. Along the Ohio and Cumberland rivers he was known as a ferryman and an occasional salvage man, someone who pulled wrecked flatboats from snags and recovered cargo that other men had written off. He lived alone on a wedge of land where Kettle Creek met the Ohio, in a house he had built himself from salvaged timber. He came to town twice a season. Nobody knew much about him, beyond that he paid his accounts on time and did not start trouble, though the scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw suggested that trouble had at some point found him. He dismounted. He tied the blood bay to the fence post with a single loop, the way a man ties a horse when he doesn't expect to be long. "What's owed?" he said. "Not a question." Braid turned. Something about the ferryman's approach made the little man's practiced composure flicker. "This is a private matter. What's owed?" August said again, in exactly the same tone. Edmund looked at him with the expression of a drowning man who doesn't trust the hand being offered but is drowning anyway. $460. August reached into the inside pocket of his canvas coat and produced a cloth bag. He set it on the porch railing between Braid and Edmund. It made the solid sound of coin, not the papery whisper of banknotes. "Count it," he said to Braid. "There's 500. The debt is cleared. The land stays." Braid's nostrils flared. He didn't reach for the bag immediately. "And what precisely," he said, "do you expect in return for this extraordinary generosity?" August looked at him for a moment. "The girl's contract," he said. "Not for your boarding house. Mine." Inside the kitchen, the floor tilted under Violet's feet. Her mother made a sound that was not quite a word. Edmund turned from the porch railing to look through the window at his daughter, and what she saw on her father's face was the most terrible thing she had ever seen. The face of a man choosing between two kinds of losing. Braid counted the coins. He was meticulous about it. When he was done, he closed his satchel, lifted it, and walked to his horse with the unhurried pace of a man who has learned never to show that he's been beaten. He paused at the gate. "She's a river-bottom girl, Ferryman," he said without turning around. "She'll be dead of fever before spring." August didn't answer. He watched Braid ride down the road until the sound of hooves faded into the tree line. Then he walked up the porch steps and stood before Edmund Voss. "I'm not a slaver," he said quietly. "I need someone to keep the house at Kettle Creek through the winter. She'll have her own room. She'll be fed and warm. When spring comes, if she wants to leave, she leaves." He paused. "What Braid had planned for her in Paducah, I heard him talking in the dry goods store last week. I couldn't let that happen." Edmund looked at his hands fonts for a long time. "Why?" he asked. "You don't know us." August glanced once at the window. Violet had come to the doorway now, standing with her arms at her sides, watching him. Something moved through his expression and was gone before she could read it. "Get your things," he said to her. "River's dropping. We need to cross before dark." Violet packed what she had in 20 minutes. 2 dresses, her mother's almanac, a wool blanket her grandmother had made. Her mother held her at the door for a long time without saying anything, which was worse than anything she could have said. Her father shook hands with August Pruitt, with the rigid formality of a man completing a transaction he would never forgive himself. For Violet did not look back as they rode down the river road. She was afraid that if she looked back she would not be able to stop. The crossing at Kettle Creek took 20 minutes on August's flat-bottomed skiff. He pulled them across in silence, reading the river current with the automatic ease of long habit, adjusting his angle without apparent thought. Violet sat in the bow and watched him work, and tried to take the measure of the man who had just purchased a significant portion of her future. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. He moved the pole with the steady patience of water itself. The house at Kettle Creek was not what she had imagined. She had imagined a trapper's crude shelter, dark and smelling of old pelts and unwashed wool. What she found was a low timber house, built solid against a hill, with a stone foundation that suggested someone had thought about permanence. A kitchen garden, put to bed for winter but carefully mulched. A woodpile stacked with the obsessive neatness of a man who takes satisfaction in ordered things. Through the single front window, she could see the orange glow of a banked fire. He helped her down from the skiff and carried her bag to the door without being asked. Inside, the front room was spare and clean. A work table with tools laid out in rows, a shelf of river charts and salvage logs, a cast iron stove that radiated heat like a blessing. In the corner, a second door, and through it, a small room with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the creek. "That's yours," he said. "There's a bolt on the inside." He cooked supper that night, without asking for her help, river catfish and cornbread and preserved green beans from a jar. He set 2 plates on the work table and sat down and ate with the economical focus of a man accustomed to eating alone. She sat across from him and ate in silence, and tried to understand the shape of the life she had entered. When the plates were cleared, she said, "Why did you really do it?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and set one in front of her. "There's a reason," he said. "I'll tell it when it's time." She went to bed that night with the bolt thrown and the wool blanket pulled to her chin and the sound of the creek outside the window running fast in the dark. She lay awake for an hour thinking about the contract, about Braid's boarding house, about the look on her father's face. She thought about August Pruitt standing at the porch railing with $500 in coin, and that expression she couldn't read. She did not feel safe, but she did not feel in danger, which was a different thing, and in her present circumstances, perhaps the more useful of the two. She was almost asleep when she noticed it. On the narrow shelf above the window, between a tin lantern and a coil of rope, sat a small object she had not registered in the evening's confusion. She reached up and took it down and held it close to the dying lamplight. It was a carved wooden fish, a catfish by the look of it, the wide mouth, the barbels, the fan of the tail fin. The carving was worn smooth in the way that things get worn when they are handled regularly over many years. Someone had carried this a long time. And then the memory arrived, with the vertiginous force of something that should not be possible. She was 11 years old. The Ohio had flooded its banks in the spring thaw, as it did most years, and a section of the levee road near Concordia Landing had given way without warning, dropping 2 feet of crumbling earth into 6 feet of fast brown water. She had gone in before she understood what was happening. The current was not the water you swam in at summer's end, lazy and warm and cooperative. This was the Ohio in April, 44 degrees, and moving with the indifferent purpose of something that did not concern itself with small girls. A boy had come in after her. Older, perhaps 16 or 17, with dark hair flattened to his face by the water, and a grip on her collar that did not loosen even when the current tried. He had dragged her up the bank and held her there while she coughed water out of her lungs. And when she had finally stopped shaking enough to see him clearly, he had pressed something into her hand. A wooden catfish, rough carved, fresh made, with a piece of river grass for a tail. He had whittled it from a piece of river drift while he waited for her to stop crying. She had lost it in the move to Gallatin County the following year. Violet sat up in the narrow bed. The carved fish rested in her open palm. Her hand was not entirely steady. In the front room she could hear the soft, regular sound of August Pruitt banking the fire before sleep, the sound of a man completing his ordinary end-of-day tasks, the sound of someone who had been doing this alone for a very long time. She looked at the fish for a long while. Then she set it back on the shelf, very carefully, exactly where she had found it, and lay down in the dark and thought about the shape of things that cannot be coincidence. She did not sleep for a long time after that. The first week at Kettle Creek passed in the manner of 2 people negotiating a shared space without a shared language. They established, through small daily acts rather than conversation, the particular grammar of the household. He banked the fire and checked the skiff and ran his trap lines along the creek before she woke each morning. She kept the kitchen, mended what needed mending, and catalogued the state of his root cellar with the practiced eye of someone who had wintered on short rations before. His stores were methodical but bachelor sparse. She reorganized them without comment. He noticed and said nothing. On the 5th day, coming in from the river with 2 largemouth bass strung on a line, he found her standing at the work table with one of his salvage charts spread open, tracing the river channels with her fingertip. He stopped in the doorway. "The snag at Deer Island," she said, without looking up. Papa lost 3 bushels of corn and a milk can in the current there in '79. It moves in spring. A pause. I know where it moves, he said. But he came and stood beside her and looked at the chart, and when he explained the secondary channel that formed against the Kentucky bank after the thaw, he spoke slowly, as if he thought she might actually be listening. She was. On the 8th night, she brought the catfish to the supper table. She set it down between the plates. August looked at it. Then he looked at her. Something happened in his face that was not quite an expression, more like an expression that he had caught before it could fully form and held in place by habit. The Concordia landing flood, Violet said. April 1872. I was 11. He was quiet for long enough that the fire snapped twice. I was 17, he said finally. My father and I were running freight south to Cairo. We'd put in at Concordia for the night when the levee went. He looked at the catfish in her palm. I made you that from a piece of driftwood while you were still coughing. I didn't think, he stopped. I didn't think you'd remember it. I kept it for a year, she said, until we moved. He picked up his fork and looked at his plate. I saw you in Carville 6 weeks ago, he said, outside the dry goods store, carrying your mother's market basket. I recognized the way you stood, the way you watched the street. A pause. I'd been looking at strangers' faces for 11 years and thinking about a girl from a riverbank. Violet felt the words settle somewhere deep. Then I heard Braid, August said, in the store, talking to his man about your father's debt, about what he'd planned. His jaw tightened. I had $500 in salvage coin from the Millard job. I'd been saving it toward a second skiff. He picked up his fork again. The second skiff can wait. She looked at the man across the table. The scarred jaw, the careful hands, the absolute absence of performance in everything he did, and understood that what she had taken for coldness was the same thing people sometimes took for coldness in her. It was not coldness. It was the particular stillness of someone who had learned to hold things close, because the things they had let go had not come back. You spent everything you had, she said. Silver's just river weight, he said quietly. Nothing I couldn't find again. The Ohio winter of 1883 arrived without courtesy and settled in with the intent of permanence. The creek froze to the bottom in January. The river, too wide to freeze across, ran with ice floes that groaned and cracked against each other in the dark. August and Violet moved through the days in the close quarters of the storm-sealed house, and the forced proximity of winter in a small space did what no amount of polite arrangement could have managed. It made them honest. He taught her to read river charts, to identify the warning color of water before a rise, to estimate the weight of cargo by the draft of a boat. She read aloud to him in the evenings, not from the Bible, though she had it, but from the almanac and the river survey reports he kept in a stack beside the work table, and he listened with the focused attention of a man who had not had a reader in a very long time. She learned that he had come to the Ohio at 19, after his father died of river fever in Cairo, that he had built the Kettle Creek house board by board over 4 years working salvage to buy what he couldn't cut, that he had been, for 15 years, entirely alone by design, because alone had seemed, after certain lessons, like the only version of safe he could construct. She did not press him for more than he offered. She had her own silences she did not invite him into. They honored each other's edges. On a bitter Thursday in mid-February, a sound woke her before dawn. Not the wind, which was constant. Not the creak of the house settling in the cold. Something wrong. The particular wrongness of a sound that should not be there. She was at the window in bare feet before she was fully awake. The creek bank was dark, but on the river road, 200 yards out, moving with deliberate quietness through the frozen dark, were 3 horses. Riders who did not carry lanterns, riders who were trying not to be heard. August was already awake. She found him in the front room pulling on his coat, the long rifle already in his hand, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has been expecting bad news and is not surprised that it has arrived. "Braid?" she asked. "His men." He moved to the window beside her. He'll have sent them to take back the salvage coin. He has a reputation for it. Waits out the season, sends collectors once the roads are passable. His voice was flat and practical. There's 3 of them. 2 carry rifles. The third has a shotgun. Go out the back, she said. Cross the creek. No. He looked at her. The ice won't hold a man's weight anymore, and I won't leave you in the house. She crossed to the shelf above the door. He had shown her the second rifle in the first week, a Winchester repeater older than his long gun, with a chip in the forestock and a trigger that needed a deliberate pull. She lifted it down. He looked at the rifle, then at her face. I've been shooting since I was 9, she said. My father had a kitchen garden that required defending from raccoons. Something moved through his expression. Raccoons, he said. They're relentless, she said. He went out the side door into the dark. She took her position at the front window, her breath fogging the cold glass, and watched the 3 riders come down the road and turn into the creekside track that led to the house. The one in front called out, Pruitt, we know you're there. Braid says the coin you used to buy the Voss girl's contract was borrowed money. He's got a note to prove it. Send out the box and we'll ride quiet. It was a practiced lie, stated as settled fact. Violet had heard men use that particular voice before, the voice of people who had learned that if you said something with enough certainty, the person on the other end often started to doubt themselves. She did not doubt herself. She raised the window sash to 2 inches. The cold came in like a blade. Mr. Braid's note, she said, loudly and clearly into the dark, won't hold in any circuit court in Kentucky, and you know it. The debt was paid before witnesses. Ride back and tell him so. A pause. The men looked at each other. The one on the right shifted his rifle to his other hand. Girls alone, he said to the others, not quietly enough. Pruitt's on the ridge above the barn, she lied, in the same clear voice. He's been there, since you hit the road bend. You rode into his range 20 minutes ago. She levered around into the chamber of the Winchester. The sound carried clean and precise in the frozen air. I'd think carefully about what you do next. The men on the road were quiet. Horses breathed white plumes into the dark. And then, from the ridge above the barn, a single shot cracked out, not aimed at anyone, aimed at the frozen creek bank, where it threw up a geyser of ice and black water 20 feet in the air. The horses panicked. The man on the right fought his animal for 10 hard seconds before it turned and bolted for the road. The man with the shotgun followed without discussion. The leader held his ground another moment, staring at the dark house and the dark ridge, doing the arithmetic. He turned his horse and rode. August came down from the ridge in the dark, moving carefully on the crusted snow. When he came through the side door, he was carrying the long rifle across both arms, and his breath was coming hard from the cold. He looked at her standing in the front room, with the Winchester still in her hands. He crossed the room in 4 steps and took her face in both hands, the careful, deliberate hands of a man who worked with fine things, and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he pulled her close and held her there, his forehead resting against her hair, his whole frame held very still. Braid won't let this go, he said, against her temple. He'll come back with more men, or he'll wait until spring and try the courts. Violet pulled back enough to look at him. Then we don't wait for him, she said. She crossed to the work table and unrolled the river chart, the one she had stood over on her 5th day at Kettle Creek, tracing the channels with her fingertip. She put her finger on a wide bend in the Ohio, 60 miles south. My father's brother lives at Smithland, she said. He's a county magistrate. He knows every land attorney in western Kentucky. She looked up at August. We take your records to him before Braid can file anything. We establish the debt clearance on record. We bury him in paperwork before he can bury us. August looked at the chart, then at her. Winter River, he said. 60 miles. You told me you'd run the Ohio in February before. I said I'd run it. I didn't say I recommended it. Do you have a better plan a moment? Then he almost smiled. Not quite, but the near miss of it was enough. I'll need to reinforce the skiff's bow planking, he said. Ice pressure. Tell me what to do, she said. I'll hold the boards. They left at first light, 2 days later, when August judged the river's mood acceptable. The Ohio in February was a cold gray world moving steadily south, carrying its ice burden with the indifferent power of deep water. August ran the current from the center channel, reading the water ahead by small signs Violet was learning to see. The darker color of deep water, the subtle V pattern that marked a submerged snag, the way the ice flows spun in the current's edge. She sat the bow and watched for surface ice and called out what she saw. And he adjusted the angle of the skiff with the pole without needing to see what she saw, because he had learned to trust her eyes. They did not talk much on the river. They had discovered over the winter that silence between them was not absence. It was a medium in which things could exist without requiring words. They reached Smithland in 3 days, putting in at the stone landing below the courthouse. Her father's brother, a heavy-set man named Archibald Voss, with the face of someone who had spent 30 years adjudicating other people's disputes, met them on the landing and looked at them both for a long time before saying anything. "You look like you've run the Ohio in February," he said finally. "We did," Violet said. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put water on." The records August had brought, the original debt certificate, the payment receipt, the bill of contract signed before a witness at the Gallatin County dry goods store, told a clean, plain story. Archibald Voss read through them twice at his kitchen table while August drank coffee, and Violet stood at the window and watched the river below. "Braid has tried this before," Archibald said, setting the papers down. "He has a pattern. Always targets farm debt, always waits for a desperate family, always finds a way to create a secondary claim after the fact." He looked at August. "You did this knowing he'd come after you?" "I knew he'd try," August said. Archibald looked at his niece. "And you?" Violet turned from the window. "I grew up watching what men like Braid do to families like mine," she said. "I'd rather run the Ohio in February than give him anything more." Her uncle held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the way men nod when they have taken the measure of something and found it sufficient. It took 3 weeks, and the testimony of the Gallatin County storekeeper who had witnessed the original payment. It took 2 letters from Archibald's attorney to a federal circuit judge. It took a formal complaint documenting Braid's pattern of fraudulent secondary claims, which the judge, it turned out, had been looking for an occasion to address. Cornelius Braid's operating license in the state of Kentucky was suspended by the first week of April. His outstanding notes were ordered reviewed. He left the state before the review was completed, which was, everyone agreed, probably for the best. On the morning they were to leave Smithland, Archibald Voss walked August down to the landing while Violet finished packing their provisions. The 2 men stood on the stone steps above the river, which was rising with the spring thaw, running the color of strong tea. "Your intentions," Archibald said, "not accusatory, simply direct." August looked at the river for a moment. "Honorable," he said, "when she's ready and not before." Her uncle studied him. "She has never been easy to protect," he said. "She doesn't require a protector. She requires someone who understands the difference between protecting a person and trusting them." "I know the difference," August said quietly. The spring that came to Kettle Creek that year arrived with the particular graciousness of a season that has been anticipated a long time. The creek bank greened. The kitchen garden came back from its winter mulch with more energy than Violet had expected, and she expanded it 6 feet on the south side because the soil there was better than August had told her, and she wanted to see what it would do. He watched her work in the garden on a Saturday afternoon in May, standing on the porch with a cup of coffee that he had stopped pretending to drink. The afternoon light was coming off the river, and she had her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her hair had come loose from its arrangement, the way it always did by afternoon, and he thought about 11 years of strangers' faces, and the specific feeling of looking for something you're not entirely sure exists anymore. She looked up and found him watching. She held his gaze without looking away. "You could help," she said, nodding at the row she was preparing. He set down the cup. He came off the porch and picked up the second hoe that was leaning against the fence. And he started on the far end of the row, and they worked toward each other in the afternoon light without speaking, and when they met in the middle he stopped and looked at her from a foot away. "I'd like to make this permanent," he said, "if you're willing." She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was thinking rather than avoiding. "I know you would," she said. "I've known for a while." She looked at him steadily. "I'm willing." He reached into his coat pocket. He had been carrying the wooden catfish for a long time. He set it in her open palm. "You should have had it back 11 years ago," he said. She closed her fingers around it. The wood was warm from his pocket. She looked at the carved fish in her hand, and then at the scarred jaw and careful hands of the man who had carved it on a riverbank when they were both too young for the world to have taught them anything yet about the cost of losing people. And she thought that perhaps the most extraordinary thing about rivers was not their power or their indifference, but the simple, stubborn fact that they always moved in one direction, that the water that left never came back, but the river itself remained. She put the catfish in her own pocket, where it fit as though it had always been meant for her. They married in June, on the Kettle Creek landing, with Archibald as witness and the Ohio running high and green behind them. There was no ceremony to speak of, a magistrate's words, 2 signatures. The practical brevity of people who had not waited this long to be theatrical about the end of waiting. That evening, August poled the skiff out to the center channel, and they sat in it as the sun went down over the Kentucky hills and the river moved beneath them, carrying everything south, the way it always had and always would, indifferent and magnificent and entirely theirs.